Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you as part of this event, sponsored by the Institute of Politics at Florida State. My name is Hans Hassel, and I'm the director of the Institute. Before we turn some time over to Dr. Holbein, I want to say a little about the Institute of Politics. We're very fortunate to have the Institute of Politics here at FSU. It provides a unique opportunity to highlight civic and political engagement in politics and in public service. We're grateful for the support of the Florida legislature and other political leaders for their leadership in recognizing the importance of creating the Institute and its location here at FSU in Florida's capital city of Tallahassee. If you haven't already, we encourage you to please check out our website at iopfsu.com and to sign up to hear more about other events. During Dr. Holbein's presentation, if you have any questions, if you haven't done a web event before, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have some time at the end to get to those. Tonight's discussion is focused on youth participation, and we're glad to have Dr. John Holbein joining us to talk about his work on young voter turnout and to highlight how policies such as civic education and electoral reform present possible solutions to low political participation among young adults. Dr. Holbein is an assistant professor of public policy at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia, and is a well-known scholar of political participation and engagement. And he, along with Sunshine Hilligus, are the authors of Making Young Voters, which was published last year by Cambridge University Press. So please welcome me in joining Dr. Holbein. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hans, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you tonight. I'm very excited to be sharing some of my research about youth voting, and in particular, this book that was the product of many years of trying to understand how to increase youth voter participation in the United States. So I'll be telling you a little bit about that tonight, giving you a broader overview of the research that we've done and the findings that we've developed that sheds some insights into why it is that so many young people in the United States don't engage in the fundamental act of democracy that is in casting a ballot, and then saying a little bit about what can be done to address those patterns. So first, to give you a sense of the general pattern. Now, this might not be a surprise to you, but the size and scope of this problem may just be a little bit, it's quite striking if you look at the statistics, okay? So what I'm gonna show for you first is a figure that plots over time, over the past 4 decades or so, rates of voter participation by age group. So on the top here, we have rates of voter participation among those individuals aged 60 and above. Now, we could slice and dice the data at different age groups. The general pattern would be the same. Okay, so we'll group this into sort of the older, no, we won't say old voters, we'll say older voters. And you can see the rates of voter participation depending on whether it's a midterm or presidential election. That's why voter turnout goes up and down. Hover around 60%, right? So we might see 60% in a general election. That's pretty common. However, what also is very common is that we see rates of youth participation lag behind those rates of older citizens. Okay, so here there's just among 18 to 29-year-olds. There's a pretty linear gradient up to a certain point in rates of voter participation by age. It sort of tapers off as you get on the higher end of the age spectrum. But overall, there's this general pattern in American politics that we've had for a long time. Even if we took this time series back even further to the 1970s, when 18-year-olds were given the right to vote, it's always been the case that older citizens are much more likely to cast the ballot than younger citizens. And another way of seeing this is by just plotting that gap, the difference between those two lines. So you can see that this gap has been largely the same, right, for the past 4 decades. And if we plotted this back even further, it would look largely the same. Even in elections recently, when we've seen a heightened interest in politics from young people and a lot of writing about young people being active participants in politics, such as 2018, we still see that this gap between older and younger voters is pretty stable. Now, you might be wondering about 2020. It's still a little bit early. If I were giving this presentation next month, I might be able to present updated figures for you with good concrete numbers for 2020. What we know from the early numbers, however, is that youth voter participation is up, But again, voter participation as a whole is up, right? So some evidence that suggests that that gap may have narrowed a little bit, but not very much, okay? So to give you some idea or to benchmark this pattern to other countries, what I'm going to show you here is instead of plotting a line over time, I'm just going to take a single period of time and look at across the world this gap between older and younger voters. And on the left-hand side, I'm going to be plotting with bars countries where this gap is smaller, and in some instances where younger voters are more likely to vote. A few countries have this pattern where younger voters are more likely to vote than older voters. But those are the anomalies, those are the outliers. By and large, across the world, it is true that older voters are more likely to vote than younger voters. On the right-hand side of the graph, you will see countries where this gap is especially acute, okay? So the United States has the dubious honor of falling on the far right-hand side of this graph, meaning what? Well, meaning that younger citizens, this gap between older and younger citizens is much larger in the United States than other comparable countries. Take Canada, our northerly neighbors, right? It's much larger than them. Other developed economic or OECD countries have gaps that are much smaller than the United States. So this problem is not unique to the United States, but it's especially bad here, right? Drawing some reason for our focus here in the United States and trying to remediate these patterns. Okay. All right. So the big question that we broach in the book is why, right? Why is it that this artifact of American politics is here? Why do we have this? And what can be done about it? That's sort of the second piece of it. So why don't more young people in the United States vote? So as a general rule of thumb, there's been a lot of folks before our book who argued that the reason why young people don't cast a ballot is because they're apathetic, they're disinterested, they just don't care about politics, right? That their levels of political interest and sort of political motivation are too low, that they just don't care, right? And you can find this narrative in popular writing, among philosophers, among political scientists who really say that political interest is the key and young people don't have that key, right? That they're not equipped with enough interest to drive them to this fundamental act, to engage in this fundamental act of democracy that is voting. Okay, and so the implication for that view is that if we want to address this problem of low youth voter turnout, what we do is we try and bump up low rates of youth voter participation or political interest. Okay, and you can see this narrative in academic research and also practical approaches to try and increase youth participation. Okay, so various organizations over the past few decades have tried to make voting cooler or more interesting, to drive up young people's interest in politics, to attack sort of this stream that many scholars have said is really important. The problem with this argument is it actually doesn't really align well with the available data that we have about young people and their levels of interest in politics. So again, plotting here for you over time from survey data, a couple of measures of political interest. Turns out it doesn't really matter which measure of political interest you use or what data set you use, you get the same general conclusion. So I've got two measures here for you. One, a survey-based measure of the extent to which young people are interested in elections, and then another measure of the extent to which young people say that they intend to cast the ballot. So as you can see here, in all elections, back all the way to the 1940s, young people have overwhelmingly said that they cared about politics. And that's been increasingly true in recent years. So upwards of 80 to 90% of young people, depending on the measure of political interest, say, yeah, I care about this. I care about what's going on in politics, and I follow it, and I really want to make sure that the elected officials are representing my interests, and I intend to cast a ballot. Okay, so it's not necessarily the case that young people are just totally apathetic or totally disinterested, right? Like this, oh, millennials these days, you know, why are millennials killing, you know, fill in the blank, right? This narrative that young people are just like apathetic and disinterested actually doesn't square with data, right? So just as a reference point, here again is their rates of voter participation. So hopefully this is sparking in your mind this idea, or solidifying in your mind this idea that young people are not lacking for political interests. What they're lacking for is actually translating that interest into action. Okay, so what we call this is the difference between sort of an interest or an intention to do something, in this case, voting. We call this the follow through gap, right? So we talk about in the book, if we really want to understand how to increase youth voting, one approach that we could try, that many organizations have tried to do, is to bump up these lines of political interest that are already sort of near the top, right? So this is the fraction of individuals who say they intend to vote or they're interested in elections. We're getting up close to 100% of young people are saying that they're interested in politics, they care, and that they intend to vote. But voter turnout is not following that upward trend. Okay, so what we might want to focus on instead of bumping up youth interest is helping and equipping young people with the skills and abilities and experiences that they need to follow through on their actions, to address this follow through gap. Okay, just to give you a little bit more motivation for focusing on follow through, another way to look at this, right? So if we just take that gap, right, the difference between intention to vote and actually voting, right? And we say, okay, let's just average over time, okay, what that gap is among young voters and older voters. That's what we've done here with this lollipop chart. You can see that that gap is much larger for younger voters than older voters. Younger voters are sort of uniquely unable to follow through on their intentions to cast a ballot, okay? So in the book, we do a lot of analysis with data, a lot of quantitative research to try and understand why it is, what stops young people from casting a ballot, and what we can do to address that potential problem. However, in the book, for the book, we also went out various locations in the United States and just had informal, semi-structured qualitative interviews with young people. And we said to them, okay, how often have you voted in the past? Why or why not have you cast a ballot? And what do you think stopped you from casting a ballot? Just to get a sense in their own words, what it was that was stopping them from actually following through on something that they said they wanted to do, something they said they cared about, something they said they even intended to do. What was it that stopped them from actually going to the polls, engaging in this foundational act of democracy? And there are, of course, when you interview people, lots of different answers, but if we distilled them down to a couple of key lessons that we heard again and again from young people around the United States, one of the key reasons that they cited for not being able to follow through or not actually following through to cast the ballot is because they lacked a sense of confidence in themselves. This was something that came up again and again, that they felt like they needed to know more than maybe sort of an outsider who was saying, okay, you need to know the candidates on the ballot, you need to know the issues at hand, you need to have some sense of this, and then you need to know the mechanics of registering and going to vote. Those pieces are probably the most important things. Young people seem to be uniquely hard on themselves, thinking that they always have to be like the political savant in their classrooms, say, who knows everything there is to know about politics, right? So here's one quotation from a young person that expressed this sort of lack of confidence, right? Oh, I don't want to vote against party or vote on party lines. You have to be educated. I don't really know. Like there's just like this lack of confidence. I don't want to be an uneducated voter. This idea that they felt like they needed to know perhaps more than they needed to know. Another thing that came up again and again, and this was a really important piece of this, and this ties into some of the quantitative research or the empirical findings that I'll present to you in a little bit, was that young people find the process of registering and casting a ballot confusing, archaic, different from what they're used to doing when they go through various processes of filling out forms and things like that. We've got to remember that for many young people who are coming from living with their parents or other guardians who often fill out a lot of forms for them, going through the basic process of filling out a voter registration form can be intimidating, right? And can be overwhelming, and they can make a lot of mistakes. So in writing our book, we came across a study that showed that among a sample of young people, about half of them, or 40 to 50% of them, would often make mistakes on their voter registration form that would cause their voter registration form to be kicked back, such as not signing, not including their social security number, making various other errors that would slow down or even stop the voter registration process. So this turns out to be a really important step in the pathway that slows down many young people from casting a ballot and in fact stops many of them from doing so. Okay. And then the final thing is that many young people are coming into their own as adults and experiencing the crush of being an adult for the first time, right at the exact moment when we tell them, okay, now it's time for you to vote, right? They're moving out of their house for work or school. And they're experiencing adulthood, and they're realizing that there's often, as many of us do, or as many of us feel very acutely in our daily lives, that there's more things to be done than there is time to do those things, right? And so for young people, they're especially sensitive to things like being overwhelmed by, an upcoming exam, or obviously they're more likely to be in school, so they're more likely to have a variety of different things that sidetrack them from voting and actually following through and casting a ballot. These are the types of things that young people told us again and again stop them from actually casting a ballot. Okay, so with that motivation, right? So number one, it's not so much about young people lacking political interest as it is young people lacking the experiences and abilities they need to follow through on the interests that they have in politics already. And number two, thinking about the obstacles or barriers that make that follow through difficult, right? That helps us to understand a little bit more about what we could potentially do as a society and as various organizations trying to ameliorate these patterns to increase youth voter participation in the United States. So I'm going to talk about two pieces of that. The first has to do with how we educate our young people in a climate where voting and registration is confusing and many young people fall by the wayside. What are a few tips for treating civics education or raising it to a higher level, and what evidence do we have of whether or not that works? And then the second piece of this is coming at it from a slightly different angle. Instead of equipping young people with skills and abilities and values they need to cast a ballot, sort of changing the person, it's changing the system, right? It's changing the structure by which we register young people, how, when, and where they can register, how, when, and where they can cast a ballot. Okay, so I'll talk through both of those. What we argue in the book is that if we really want to get young people to cast a ballot, it's best to have sort of the 1-2 punch, right? To equip young people to overcome the given obstacles and barriers that they face to cast a ballot, but also to structure it, the voting process, such that the voting obstacles and barriers are conducive to young people, that are minimized as much as we can. Okay. All right. So on the first piece with regards to civics, I sort of want to set up for you the current state of the world. Okay, what is the current terrain of civics? And to get an idea of this, we did a variety of different things. We reviewed civics textbooks. We looked at civics requirements for graduation. We interviewed civics teachers and school administrators to see what was going on in civics classrooms, again, to sort of like get in under the hood and say, okay, what's the current state of the world when it comes to civics? This key component of the public education system, and potentially this key lever that we could pull if we wanted to make sure that young people were equipped to cast a ballot, to be active participants in democracy. Okay, so this ideal you can find in any number of sources. In the book, we talk about how the idea of civic education being a core value of democracy goes all the way back to sort of ancient Greece, as many ideas do, but it comes all the way through from the founding of the United States to debates over whether or not education should be public or not, all the way to contemporary policymakers who have all argued that a core part of the education system should be this aspect that equips young people with the knowledge and attributes and skills that they need to be actively involved in forms of collective governance. Okay, so this quote by Arne Duncan says, civics should equip students with the very skills they need to work collectively. That's the vision, right? And we see that from ancient Greece all the way through George Washington, John Adams, various members of the Supreme Court, various Supreme Court justices and policymakers today. The reality, sadly, is that it very often it is the case that civics is not so much a noble venue for instilling in young people the skills and attributes they need to be active in democracy. However, instead, it becomes more about teaching young people to memorize facts about history, and particularly American history. Okay, so this report from the National Center for Learning and Citizenship from a few years ago says the reality is that civics usually spends little time focusing on how people can participate as citizens, and rather encouraging them to memorize various aspects of American history, historical Supreme Court justices, dates, and times. It becomes more about memorizing information about history than it is about working with contemporary political issues and getting to sort of talking about being active in politics today. Okay, so from this review that I was talking about of textbooks, graduation requirements, and school officials at various levels, here are a couple of facts about civics education today. So a lot of civics teachers report across the country, there's been sort of in this post No Child Left Behind era, a declining emphasis on civics education, that there's fewer requirements for civics in graduation standards, fewer measures of progress of students when it comes to civic, and just a declining emphasis overall. One thing that we discovered when we were writing the book was that there's definitely this phenomena that comes up in all of these sources, that civics today is dominated by what we call bubble sheet civics. And this is sort of what I was just talking about a moment ago, is that civics has become less about equipping and preparing young people for active participation in democracy, and it becomes more about teaching them to memorize facts that can be regurgitated on a bubble sheet exam, right? And many of these things focus on history rather than contemporary events. And then finally, many civics instructors, for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to talk about why this is the sort of the status quo. However, many civics teachers feel pressured to basically just lecture at students, right? To dominate the lecture, as opposed to actively involving young people in various projects that would get them excited about democracy and talking about various political debates, or helping out in their community, trying to solve a social problem, or meeting with various elected officials, sort of a more active learning approach. That's strayed away from and for more of a teacher-dominated approach. Okay. And like I said before, this was corroborated again with textbooks that we looked at, requirements that we examined, and interviews we conducted with education officials. So in our book, one of the chapters that talks about whether or not this approach works, we collected data from every single data set that we could find. Some of them from survey data that measured kids over time as they went through middle school and high school onto their adult lives, into some of them voting and some of them not. We collected some information from school administrative records that tracked kids' course taking habits over time. And then we also looked at changes in civics requirements across the states over the past 3 or 4 decades, and looked at whether or not, when students get more of this traditional civics approach, this bubble sheet civics that's focused on teacher-dominated lectures, it focuses on teaching kids knowledge and facts about politics, mostly American history, whether or not that works, whether or not just giving kids more of that really encourages them to vote, fills this gap, encourages young people to cast a ballot. And what we found universally across all of these data sets was that the current approach to civics, what we call traditional civics education, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't actively encourage young people to vote in politics. In fact, if you take a student who's given a lot of this, who's spoon-fed a lot of traditional civics, they're no more likely to cast a ballot than someone who takes 0 or 1 civics education classes. It's pretty stark. It suggests that maybe we could do something different, right? So in this chapter of our book, we don't just stop by saying, okay, here's what's wrong, it doesn't seem to be working, this civics education approach, but we try and distill a few lessons that from various other isolated programs that have been tried, approaches that have been tried and tested, that shows some promise for changing civics so that it can instill in young people the skills and experiences they need to become active participants in democracy. Okay. So I'm just going to distill this down. If you're interested, the chapter goes into much greater detail about what civics can do and what teachers and administrators at various levels can do. And just going to distill it down to 3 key lessons and provide you a little bit of evidence from backing this up that shows the promise of these approaches. So the first thing that we talk about in the book and in this chapter specifically about civics is that civics should not only teach young people facts about American politics and about American history, but they should also do more. They should try and instill in young people the skills and values and attitudes and experiences that they need to actually be active participants in democracy. They should equip them with the ability to follow through. They should equip them with the ability to work well with other people in collaborative environments. They should learn what many education scholars have called social and emotional skills or non-cognitive skills or soft skills that will help as a cocktail, will help mobilize them, will help equip them to become active voters down the road, okay? The second thing that schools should do is try and transition, and there are a lot of reasons, like I said before, that teachers want to stay in sort of this more teacher-dominated approach of teaching American history as opposed to getting students involved in active civics projects in the community, meeting with elected officials, debating contemporary political issues. There's reasons why teachers stray away from that. We can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A if you want to. But there's been some really good evidence that suggests that when schools go beyond that and actually do these types of things that get students involved on the ground with contemporary political issues and with contemporary politics, that it increases the chances those young people will vote for the rest of their lives, okay? And then finally, just a very mechanical step that often gets in the way of young people casting a ballot. Schools have a great opportunity to help young people overcome these barriers that I was talking about earlier, helping them make sure that they have the opportunity to fill out voter registration forms. They're given the help they needed to do so. And in so doing, this will help prepare them for the actual voting process when they turn 18 and become eligible to vote. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these very quickly, very briefly, and then we'll turn at the end to what we know about actually changing the voting system itself. Okay, so this is still focusing on voters, how we can equip young voters, how we can equip them to become active participants in democracy. So if many of you might be familiar with sort of, if we're talking about social and emotional skills, you might be familiar with sort of the classic Marshmallow Experiment. So this is the type of thing we're talking about, a measure of ability that it goes beyond sort of what would be measured on a standardized test. These are like delayed gratification, grit, perseverance, self-regulation, social skills. These types of measures that are not totally captured if you give someone a math or reading exam, but turn out to be really important in a variety of different domains in one's life. We're arguing in the book that these social and emotional skills play a really important role in encouraging young people to actually follow through, to overcome the hurdles and obstacles that stand in the way of casting a ballot. We have some evidence that suggests that when kids develop these skills, they're more likely to translate that also in the political realm. Okay, these skills, there's evidence that these are not things that you're just born with and you have for the rest of your life. These skills can be taught, and then there's, as we're arguing in the book, evidence that suggests that the social and emotional skill development should be a really important part of civics. Right, so for this, we have a couple of programs that we've studied the effect of them on rates of youth voter participation. These two programs are for the statisticians out there or the empirical scholars out there, are randomized controlled trials. These are programs that were targeted at various points in the schooling program that randomly assign some students to get their program, or randomly assign some students to not get their program, and then tracked those students over time through the rest of their lives. We've subsequently matched those participants to voter records, the public use voter records. And are able to see whether or not these programs that took various approaches to teaching kids social and emotional skills to persevere when things got difficult, to work well in groups with other people, whether or not that actually translated into gains in voter participation down the road many years later when those young people were actually active participants in politics. So I won't say too much about these programs, how they did them. I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A if you'd like. The Fast Track Project and the Good Behavior Game took different approaches to teaching kids these social and emotional skills. But ultimately, what we find across both of these studies that we've conducted is that if you develop kids early on social and emotional skills in a civics environment or another classroom environment, it increases the chance that they are going to cast a ballot. So for the Fast Track program, that increase in voter participation is somewhere on the order of about 7 to 9 percentage point increase in this experimental study. In the Good Behavior Game, a more recent work that we've done, there's evidence that suggests that kids who develop these social and emotional skills are about 9 to 10 or maybe even 11 percentage points more likely to cast a ballot in adulthood than those who didn't have this program. Okay, so this suggests that going beyond sort of dry, boring, cognitive-based civics education to social and emotional skill development really helps. Okay, encourage young people to cast a ballot later on. Okay, there's been some good evidence too that suggests that when we go from this dry, sort of traditional, not really focusing on contemporary politics, but to a more active learning environment, that also increases the chances that young people will cast a ballot. So we have some good evidence from a set of sort of newer schools, namely democracy prep public schools. Some of you may be familiar with this approach, others might not. To give you a general idea, democracy prep public schools have as their core mission weaving through their curriculum and the ethos of active civic participation. So students who are in democracy prep public schools are getting to meet with public officials often. They're designing various projects to address social issues in their community. They're debating contemporary political issues. They're going out when elections are coming up and helping people register to vote who are eligible to do so, or canvassing to encourage those who are already registered to cast the ballot. They're talking about politics. It's a much different approach than this sort of dry traditional civics that I was telling you about earlier. We have some good research that we cite in the book that was recently published in the American Political Science Review from another set of scholars from Mathematica Policy Research that shows that kids who are sort of randomly assigned to this curricula we're about 7 percentage points more likely to vote, right? So this might not do everything. It might not fill that full gap that I showed you earlier between older and younger voters, but it does put a meaningful dent and pushes a lot of young people who wouldn't have voted without this sort of active learning civics environment to a world where they would actually cast a ballot. Okay, and then finally, for civics education, we have good evidence that suggests that just going through the schools, just going through the mechanical process of helping their students register to vote and getting a little bit more information about voting can actually encourage them to follow through and cast a ballot as well. Okay, so this is a really important part of the process that many schools sadly skip. However, we do have some good evidence that suggests that when schools don't skip this process, when they go into the classroom, provide young people with voter registration forms, show them what a ballot looks like, give them an opportunity to sort of play around with the levers, pulling the levers, and talking a little bit about the importance of voting, that this increases the chances that young people will vote later on in life. Okay. So just very briefly to conclude here, I do want to save time for Q&A. What's on the other side of this? So I said the 1-2 punch, right? So the one is equipping young voters to be able to be prepared with the skills and experiences they need to cast a ballot. The other is structuring the system, the voting system itself, thinking about how, when, and where people can register and how, when, and where they can actually cast a ballot. Okay, so in the book, we don't consider all electoral reforms. There's some more recent electoral reforms that we just need more time to see their effects. I'm thinking about things in particular like automatic voter registration that people have talked about recently, or there's been a couple of localities around the United States that have, instead of bringing young voters into the voting process at 18, they've said, okay, let's bring 16 and 17-year-olds into vote. And you might say, wait a minute, that's not allowed. It turns out that you can actually do this in local elections. So there have been a few municipalities, a few in Maryland and in Berkeley, California, and another couple of places that say, okay, 16 and 17-year-olds can cast a ballot in local elections. These types of reforms are so brand spanking new that we're just still waiting a little bit longer to see what their effects are. So they offer some promise. There's some reason we talk about in the book that these types of reforms might have a meaningful effect. However, we do have a number of reforms that we've had for a number of decades now that we can look and see when we adopt these types of reforms, when we adopt no excuse absentee voting, early voting on the voting side of the equation, or we tinker with the registration process to make it easier to register and cast a ballot, or to register and turn in a registration form, whether or not that actually increases the odds that young people cast a ballot. So we're talking about things like pre-registration. Again, this is a mechanism and vehicle by which many young people are provided with opportunities to register and or overcome that hurdle when they're still enrolled in school. Same-day registration, where if they miss a voter registration deadline, they're able to register on election day or during an early voting period when they show up to cast the ballot, or various modes of online registration that perhaps young people might be more comfortable with than, say, paper voter registration, having to find a stamp, putting it in the mail, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and so what we find in our study, I won't dive too deeply into the weeds of where these estimates come from, I'm happy to talk to you about it, is that the types of reforms that increase the chances that young people will cast a ballot are those that make it easier to register to vote. Again, going back to our interviews with young people, voter registration is a big barrier that stands in the way of young people casting a ballot. So when you do things like, okay, let's sort of like lessen the load of voter registration barriers, so that if a young person forgets or doesn't know that there's a voter registration deadline, they show up to cast the ballot, say with one of their friends that brought them along with them, this same-day registration states will allow them to do this. And this increases the chances that young people will cast a ballot. And indeed, it has bigger effects than it does on older citizens, right? So these effects for same-day registration are bigger for younger voters. Same thing for pre-registration and online registration, evidence that these increase the chances that young people will actually cast a ballot and fulfill this core tenet of democracy. Okay, so tonight I've talked a little bit about the book. I'm happy to answer any further questions you might have. This was a short overview. We have a lot of other discussion about other potential ways to mobilize young people, but I'll go ahead and stop there for now, and I'm very excited to chat with you all and answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was absolutely delightful in terms of understanding better the larger picture here and some of the ways that we can possibly improve young voter turnout and participation in democracy. And I think it's a really important topic, and one that the Institute of Politics has really tried to push. And so we really appreciate your perspective here about this and about the process of doing that. There are a couple questions. One individual just wanted a little bit more description of the PAC's good behavior games. Can you give a little bit more description of what that is, or what these programs are, and how they engage young voters or encourage them to participate more?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So the two programs that I mentioned earlier, the Fast Track program and the Good Behavior Game, have different approaches to teaching. Both of them are targeted at teaching kids social and emotional skills. Generally, they're not necessarily like political focus programs. They're more like, let's equip students with like general life skills, such that when like an obstacle comes and gets in their way, they'll be able to overcome it. That they'll be able to persevere, to be gritty, to delay gratification, and to work well with other people. So they take the two programs. The Fast Track project takes a more of a sort of a teacher-oriented approach, wherein teachers provide students with various presentations, various formats that sort of teaches them these skills. They have it's sort of like woven into various aspects of the classroom experience. The Good Behavior Game does that, but it also weaves into this process a set of incentives for learning good behavioral skills. So I should say that both of these projects are targeted at sort of like elementary middle schoolers, right? So both of these are helping kids to develop these social and emotional skills. In the good behavior game, it's a program that was developed a long time ago, and there's actually a big evidentiary base in child psychology that suggests that when you reinforce positive self-regulation among children, that they learn to develop those skills and that they keep those skills over time. So the good behavior game, it's a game in the sense that it provides in various classroom settings, say in a reading or a math or an English class, it reinforces good behavioral skills with various incentives, along with training young people in learning to control their own thoughts, emotions, motivations, and behavior. So there's a lot of good research out there on the good behavior game. It tends to be targeted at children. Some of the things we're talking about in the book are trying to teach skills that will benefit young people throughout their lives. However, you can start to think about how we might transition this to high schoolers, or maybe a little bit earlier, to middle schoolers who are still developing their social and emotional skills, or their non-cognitive skills. You might think about various ways of using these principles of using incentives and rewards to train young people to develop their skills, using various presentations and classroom elements that focus on developing one's ability to control their thoughts, emotions, motivations, and behaviors. But that's a little bit about the good behavior game. There's a lot of good evidence out there on the good behavior game that I'm happy to share with folks if they're interested in knowing further.
So one of the other questions that someone else asked was this question of any suggestions of ways we can get involved in this, or perhaps promote these things or encourage these things in schools or in our communities. What are some ways that individuals can promote and encourage these sorts of behaviors? A lot of this has been institutionally focused. Is there ways that we can become involved in doing this sort of work?
It's a great question, and I think it's a piece of this. It gives me heart that Kyle, I think, is thanks for asking that, because it gives me a lot of hope that people actually care about this and want to push this forward. So I guess the tongue-in-cheek response that I would give here is I'm happy to send a copy of my book to anyone who's interested in this, and I mean that seriously. But also, I think there are a lot of organizations out there that are trying to address this problem of low rates of youth civic participation, right? So when I think about organizations that are trying to play around with mobilizing young people and trying to not play around, experimenting with different approaches, new ways of trying to think about mobilizing young people. I think of Circle is an organization out of Tufts University. You might look at some of their resources that they're developing and trying to understand how to better apply them in colleges and even in high schools. So I might point you to Circle. It's an organization out of Tufts. It's pretty sporadic, though. I mean, there are a lot of people who provide sort of like say that they have a desire to mobilize young people, but this is one of the difficult aspects of actually putting this into action. Is like various organizations will come and go in their interest to mobilize young people. So like one of the things we talk about in the book is that like the current status quo for mobilizing young people is to rely completely on political campaigns, and specifically presidential campaigns every 4 years. And that approach is just not enough, right? Like it leaves out students who are coming of age in between presidential elections, and these campaigns clearly are only wanting to mobilize one certain type of young voters, the young voters that will vote for their candidate, right? So that's a long-winded answer, but sort of the direct answer to your question is to look up Circle. Circle has a lot of resources and are experimenting with various different ways of trying to mobilize young people.
The next couple of questions deal with the legislature. So one, Olivia here has a question: what is your pitch to the legislature as to why they should adopt these learning targets, thinking about emotional skills and therefore those sorts of things? And is there a way to measure these and measure school performance that could be sold to the legislature as a way to get them to be more inclined to adopting that sort of curriculum in the classroom?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Olivia, for this. So on the first piece of this, one of the really cool things about research on social and emotional skills is that the benefits that come from developing these skills in kids aren't just restricted to civics, right? So there's been a lot of good research that suggests that when you train kids in schools to be gritty, to be perseverant, to learn how to control their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, to work well with other kids, those general skills result in increased academic performance, decreased crime, better health, right? So when I think about these types of reforms that don't necessarily just need to be targeted at civics classrooms, but can be brought into civics classrooms, but also at other aspects of educational programming. The benefits are not just restricted to being more civically active, right? So I would say, if a legislator is like, oh, well, okay, these voting findings are interesting, but what I really care about is reducing criminal recidivism, right? There's a lot of good research that suggests that these general life skills translate in other domains as well. So that's one thing that I would say. It's a great question about measuring the skills. It's I would say that in good faith, I couldn't recommend at this time fundamentally bringing in measures of social and emotional skills into sort of performance-based accountability systems. And the reason for that is we talk about in the book that there's just not a real agreement about how to measure these things. So there's lots and lots of different approaches. And in the book, we take a comprehensive approach and like pull together all different ways of measuring these skills that we could find. So some of them are like, one approach is to just ask people like a direct set of battery of questions saying like, okay, how often when things are difficult do you persevere, right? Like it's directly asking them. Another is to have experts go and evaluate kids, how well they work well with other kids and things like that. These different measures, there's lots of them. In the book, we cite something like 100 different scales for measuring social and emotional skills. I'd say the science isn't quite there yet to translate this into sort of an accountability-based mechanism. So there's a general sense or general evidence from research that these skills matter, but it's not like we have this one magic bullet way of measuring that avoids sort of gaming and other issues that you worry about when we think about performance accountability measures. So I know that's not a satisfying answer right now, but it's something that many scientists, including myself, are working on.
John, do you think that that's a barrier for legislators to enact these sorts of laws, is just the ability to keep those accountable, or to measure those the production of those teachings in the classroom?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's the measures are there, right? So if I were advising a legislature to do this, or that was wanting to expand social and emotional learning training, I would say, let's make sure that we measure this in several ways. Let's make sure that we use the science that has been developed and say, okay, we're going to develop a rigorous system that uses several different ways of measuring these skills. And that might be a hurdle, right? Like with each measure that you bring in, you're adding a cost or of time, right? Of students, being observed or being watched. It is a tricky thing to overcome. But if you did really want to do this well and see the progress of your students, I would suggest taking a sort of a multi-faceted approach that measures these skills in several different ways. It's not that the measures don't exist. It's that I couldn't boil down to you like the one silver bullet way of measuring them. However, if there were conversations to be had in the future from this, you could say like, okay, here are 2 or 3 ways if you really wanted to make sure these skills are getting developed. We can come at it from different angles and really see the full picture of the extent to which these skills are being developed. Great question. Thank you for that.
Another one of our IOP fellows, Callie Holiday, asked this question about the voter bills that are being considered currently in Georgia, which would ban no excuse voting and require prospective voters to include ID numbers when applying and returning for absentee ballots. How would that impact young voters? Would it is the bulk of the barriers here, is that primarily registration, or would sort of the absentee no excuse process also impact young voters there as well?
Yeah, so I want to be careful here in answering this question because part of me, wants to sort of put a pin in research that we've done from recent decades, and sort of just say let's use that information to like generally think about general lessons that we can learn. But I think and the general lesson we can learn is that young people are especially sensitive to these, like how hard it is to register and to vote. However, there are reasons to suspect in the current time period that the effects that we've documented in previous research. So I showed you the effects of no excuse absentee voting in previous periods in recent decades, pre-COVID, and implementing no excuse absentee doesn't really mobilize young people that much. However, in the current COVID environment, where we've just seen this election where masses of people are using various aspects of vote by mail, right? That is a fundamentally changing variable where we're seeing a drastic uptake in usage of this mode of voting. So I'd say I wouldn't overgeneralize from my findings to the current time period. It's possible that this is going to negatively affect young people, especially. I would say that if you really, however, like if you're really dedicating to getting more young people to cast a ballot, I wouldn't just rely on like absentee valid voting, vote by mail efforts to expand those things. I would take a much more comprehensive approach. But in the current moment, I would definitely not misuse our research to say, oh, because absentee voting didn't really have an effect in recent years or recent decades, that it doesn't matter today. I mean, we're seeing a fundamental restructuring of how people are casting a ballot. And so I want the science to sort of catch up with that and leave open the possibility that, yeah, these young people are especially sensitive in general to voting and registration costs. So we should be really careful.
Professor Jackson asks, we keep asking more and more from our K through 12 education, right? To what extent is an underlying factor, is society an underlying factor, especially regarding the skills of children that changes across time and family structure and socialization and home, right? Can these problems be solved just in the schools, or is this something we need to think about as a larger society about the norms that we have, structuring family engagement and participation and the responsibilities that parents have?
It's a great question. Thank you so much for that, Professor Jackson. So I think I definitely take your point. That we ask a lot from our public school teachers. I will say that in our interviews with civics instructors across the country, many of them said that what we were thinking about, like we were sort of broaching these conversations of like, what do you do in your civics classroom? A lot of them said, well, we teach American history, teach bubble sheet civics. But they would then say, sort of unprompted, like, what we really want to be doing is having contemporary debates about politics. What we really want to be doing is teaching kids how to register and to vote. What we really want to be doing is like a project that gets kids excited about meeting with their elected officials and helping increase some initiative to improve their communities that they live in. That's what we really want to be doing. But there's all these like obstacles that get in the way. One of the obstacles is that parents, right? That parents don't necessarily want their kids to be talking about climate change or contemporary political issues. That can be kind of a sticky thing. They might worry about, sort of backlash on those sides. So I do take your comments, Professor Jackson, to heart. But I think that the types of skills that we're talking about are the types of things that many teachers want to be instilling in their students. So we should be thinking about the things that stop them from doing that, right? So that's a piece of this. Another part of this is totally it's not just up to schools, right? Like it's I'm a big believer that social and emotional skills develop in a variety of different contexts, and I think the research from economics and child psychology would back this up. Most of the time we spend looking at schools because that's the area where we can pull levers that might change things, right? But when we think about more fundamentally, more at its roots, where do social and emotional skills come from? It's family environment, it's community environment. In some instances, it might be religious training or environment and upbringing. And then schools are a piece of that, but not the only piece of it, right? So definitely, I would say that there are there is room for changing education systems to emphasize social and emotional skills more, and there are reasons to suspect that would be well received by instructors or among teachers, among other folks. But it's also, if we really wanted to do this, we'd also want to think outside of schools too. So I totally agree with you on that.
Dylan asked this question: is there a chance? So this is referring back to some of the early data you presented on individuals' intention to vote and their interest in politics. Is there a chance that younger people surveyed about their intention to vote and their interest in politics felt pressured to go against their true feelings and say they had an interest and intention to vote, right? So misrepresenting because of social norms. And may this perhaps underestimate the sort of the effect of motivations and interests that have really on behaviors.
It's a great question. Thanks for that, Dylan. So it's a tough problem to get at, to potentially address. One thing that so Sunshine, who is my co-author on this book, wasn't able to be here tonight, but she's a survey methodologist. So one thing that social scientists have done to try and address or to see the extent to which social desirability is driving these findings is to take various survey modes, right, to change the mode by which you're surveying things. So the idea is that, if you're sitting down with a surveyor face to face and they're asking you, okay, do you want to vote? Like, are you interested in politics? Do you care about these things? And they've just taken a long political survey with this person. They might feel that social pressure, especially, like, we're really like social creatures. So in that environment, they'll feel a lot of pressure to magnify, to over-report how much they actually want to be involved. However, if you administer the same survey to an online environment where they're all by themselves, no one's watching, in theory, some researcher's going to see my responses. It doesn't totally take away social desirability, but it tones it down a little bit. So in the book, we show evidence from the ANES, which is a survey that has some subjects take the survey with a person interviewer versus an online format, that these levels of political interest are high, regardless of whether or not you're measuring it with a person there in the room, or if it's just by yourself, no one else watching, you're still reporting the same levels. So that would suggest that social desirability is not as big of a deal here. The other thing that I would say, however, is, like, on the one hand, like, it doesn't seem to be playing that big of a role. However, even if it is social desirability that's driving these findings, you could argue that the fact that they're internalizing a norm that I should say that I'm interested to vote suggests that they are sort of, like, at least, like, oriented towards this, that they're responsive to that norm, that they care about what other people think about them, is like showing that we're doing a relatively good job as a society teaching that, oh yes, I should be oriented towards doing this. This is a good thing to do. I should be interested in and set towards doing this. That's a piece of it, right? That's a way of thinking about how politically motivated people are, is the extent to which they respond to this social pressure. However, we don't see it. We don't think it plays as big of a role, but it's a great question.
So similar question. So do you see evidence of low buy-in as a rationale for not voting, or the perception that parties don't care about young people? If so, do you see low buy-in among more socially politically marginalized youth? And is that perhaps a driver in turnout and participation?
It's a great question. Thanks for asking that, Anthony. So it's a project that I want to do down the road. And actually, Hans and I have talked about doing this study together that looks at the role of various candidate characteristics, sort of looks at whether or not when there's, this came up in the 2020 elections when Bernie Sanders didn't secure the Democratic nomination. There was a lot of concern that young people wouldn't turn out as a result. I would say that, it's possible that young people, and we have some survey data that suggests that young people are dissatisfied with the candidates they have to vote for. That being said, even in the current climate where there is this dissatisfaction with who is running for office, who they have available to vote for, young people are still saying that they intend to vote, that they care about politics. They're showing this desire to participate, even in this climate where there's not their preferred candidates in many cases running, or candidates that look like them, that look like the candidates that they want to run. So I think this is a piece of the puzzle potentially. It could play a role in mobilizing or demobilizing young people. It's something we don't have a lot of good research, but we're trying to fix that. However, I think it is a testament, and we should, like, one of the things we wanted to make sure in this book is that we weren't bashing young people, right? I think it's a testament to young people that even if they don't have the candidates they like, they still say, okay, we've got to do the best with what we have. We got to push forward. We want to be a part of this. They just get stopped along the way for various reasons.
Francisco asks, so you indicated various percentage increases in likely voter turnout for each of the 3 recommended approaches: social, emotional skill development, active learning, teaching how to. Do you know if doing all 3 would have an accumulative effect, or are these do these build upon each other, or is it a multiplicative effect, or is it just sort of an additive effect that we would expect to find? And do you have any evidence or any thoughts regarding the overall effect of implementing these things?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Francisco, for this. The short answer is we don't have good evidence of the cumulative effects. These programs have been evaluated in isolation. However, you could think that, just big picture, sort of theoretically, that these types of approaches might target different types of people. And so you might see cumulative effects. So for example, the type of person who is being taken from a world where they have lower self-regulatory skills to a world where they're having higher self-regulatory skills, that's probably mobilizing a different type of voter than the one that's all they need is help on the voter registration form, right? So these are 2 different people. One of them is someone you're getting to, say, there's a long line on election day, and because you taught them to persevere, to achieve their goals, to keep going when the going gets tough, they keep going when the going gets tough, right? Whereas the other intervention is targeting someone who's like, yeah, I'm on board, right? Like, I'll stand in line, that's fine, but like, I just didn't register, right? Like, registering was archaic and unfamiliar to me. So you could theorize that these effects are cumulative. We don't have good evidence on that at present. So for now, TBD.
One last question for you, Dr. Holbein. This is a university, and these are a lot of these individuals that the professors are dealing with, and the students that are on this webinar. They are interested in politics. What can they do to help their peers and others around them to participate as well, right? How do we try to encourage those individuals who aren't participating in this process? How can we as friends and teachers do a better job at that?
It's a great question. I think the lesson from the program that I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned the title, but it was the First Time Voter program. This was a program that was done in high schools and mostly high schools, but they've replicated in colleges around the United States. It shows that a little bit of effort goes a long way. And by that, I mean, providing young people with help registering to vote is a big thing. Right. So being there to answer there were questions about like, what do I do with this voter registration form? And like, what do I need to fill out? Making sure they're filling out the right things. That matters. Right. So I don't know if the same thing happened at Florida State as at Virginia and other places that I've been in the past. Lots of like efforts by students to register their fellow students. That matters, right? Like, that's really important, and there's good evidence that it has effects. So things like that are not too small, right? So just keep up the helping of young people to register, to overcome that barrier. It matters and makes a difference.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Holbein. We appreciate this. We hope that those participating have enjoyed this webinar, and if you haven't already signed up for updates at the IOP website, please go and do that. We have lots of events in the future, the rest of the semester, and then again in the fall, we'll be with a number of these programs to help promote and encourage civic education and political participation in public service, which is one of the primary goals and aspirations of this of the Institute. So thank you all for coming this evening. We really appreciate you taking the time, Dr. Holbein, to do this.
Thanks very much.